the next stage of Israel's military operation, they lead us to believe will target parts of the south. That's where they believe much of Hamas's military infrastructure has moved to. That's where they believe many of Hamas's key leaders remain at the moment.
And the truce between Israeli forces and Hamas appears to have held for a third full day, with Hamas having released a total of 14 Israeli and 3 foreign nationals, and the Israeli prison service confirming that the release of 39 Palestinian prisoners. Tomorrow, though, the truce is due to come to an end, which does leave some questions about what comes next. Let's ask Jonathan Marcus, former defence and diplomatic correspondent for the BBC. Jonathan, good evening.
Yes, good evening.
Let's just start with today, Jonathan, that appears to have gone at least more smoothly than yesterday.
Yes, indeed. It was clear that the hiccup or the delay, if you like, had arisen from perhaps misunderstandings, perhaps feelings certainly on the Hamas side that the Israelis hadn't entirely honoured their end of the bargain. But it looks as though it was clearly cleared up very quickly. We're expecting now one more day of the exchanges, tomorrow, Monday, and then the whole arrangement, in theory, ends at 7 a.m. On Tuesday, though there do seem to be intensive efforts underway to try and prolong this pause in one way or another. A Qatari delegation has been in Israel. They have been the crucial intermediaries between the Israelis, the Americans, and indeed the Hamas leadership. There's an idea, perhaps, that for every continuing day of the military pause, 10 more Israeli hostages might be handed over. So the end of this arrangement isn't inevitable, but it's going to be very difficult, I think, very traumatic, clearly, for many of the families involved to follow what happens over the coming 24 hours.
Can I draw you to an interview with the Qatari Prime Minister in the Financial Times tonight? Just in the last hour, they've published an interview with Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, who has told the Financial Times that more than 40 other women and children are being kept captive in Gaza who are not believed to be held by Hamas. These are people who are believed to be in other locations. Hamas has told Qatar that the fighters didn't capture those civilians, blamed it on other militant groups, and ultimately are not sure where they are. There is a suggestion that an extension to that might help get an extension because it would allow Hamas to locate those hostages, but that seems like a very concerning development.
Well, it's something that's been known about, I think, for some time. I mean, the figures that are given regularly about how many hostages actually there are to some extent still estimates. People don't know what condition these people are in, how many bodies were actually taken by the Hamas terrorists when they went back into Gaza. It's certainly been clear from the outset that some individual hostages are being held by groups like Islamic Jihad, by sort of crime organizations in the Gaza Strip and so on. Now, how sincere Hamas is in terms of its desire to find all these people. And remember, given the dislocation inside Gaza, there may be considerable practical problems as well. But we just don't know how sincere they are. But it does underscore the fact that we still really don't know exactly the numbers or the condition of all the hostages. There probably aren't names for all of them. And there is still an awful amount of uncertainty. And of course, this uncertainty is something that Hamas is using for its own ends. It realizes that the dynamics in Israel have changed significantly once the first hostages have begun to return. There is a huge public wave of pressure on the Israeli government to keep this hostage for Palestinian prisoners exchange going. And of course, the longer that Hamas can forestall any resumption of hostilities, that clearly is in their interests as well.
What is your hunch, Jonathan, somebody who's followed these events for a while now, as to how this does go after the truce ends after tomorrow?
I think it's going to get much, much messier, and are unfortunately much more difficult. Remember the situation on the ground for Palestinians, many of them refugees within the Gaza Strip, having been forced to move south, urged by the Israeli military to move away from the north. They are congregated in huge numbers in the south. Conditions are not great. There are concerns from humanitarian organizations about disease and so on and so forth. Remember, many of these people are children. The Gaza Strip has an extraordinary population structure with a very large cohort of kids there. So that's deeply worrying. Now, of course, the next stage of Israel's military operation, they lead us to believe will target parts of the south. That's where they believe much of Hamas's military infrastructure has moved to. That's where they believe many of Hamas's key leaders remain at the moment. Now, this clearly, in terms of just on the ground, the military and the fighting could be very grim. But I think politically and diplomatically, it's going to raise a lot of problems for the Israelis. I mean, remember, there's international public opinion, the clock of international public opinion. How much more of this devastation is going to be tolerated, I think, is very limited. But crucially, the Americans, President Biden, wants the Israelis to pursue any campaign in the South in a very different way, in a much more targeted way, with much less destruction. I think the Americans remain deeply concerned by the fact that the Netanyahu government in Israel doesn't really seem to have any clear idea about what the end state of its operation is going to be. They have no clear idea as to who's going to be running Gaza in the aftermath of this crisis. And so the potential for tensions between Israel and the United States will only grow as the operation continues.
Okay, Jonathan, really insightful as ever. Thank you for your time tonight. Jonathan Marcus, former defence and diplomatic correspondent for the BBC, with us on Times Radio.